In this recording, we will explore communication, using communication tools for success, particularly in the workplace. The roadmap for this recording includes describing the communication process and identifying strategies for improving communication, understanding the channel of communication and the network of communication, identify the barriers to effective communication, and some solutions to those barriers. Did you play the game of telephone when you were a kid? As you can see from the picture, you start with saying one thing, and by the time it rolls down to a couple more people, the message changes. This game is a fun way to demonstrate how difficult it can be to be very clear with communication. Communication continues to be one of the most challenging issues at any workplace. Managers across many industries struggle to find effective and successful communication tactics. What is communication? Well, the definition of communication is the transmission of information from one person to another to create a shared understanding or feeling. Now that you know the definition, take a moment and think about your own life. Professionally, personally, or even maybe as a student. Can you think of times when there was an accurate transmission of information? Can you think of a time there was an inaccurate transmission of information or miscommunication? How were they different? What happened? Why did the miscommunication occur? Are you aware of some ways it could have been improved? As we explore the different processes and elements of communication, use this example to relate back to. Communication in an organization is often very similar within your personal life. Remember, communication is the transmission of information from one person to another to create a shared understanding or feeling. So for communication to be effective in an organization, it involves moving that message from one person to another in an accurate way. However, the effectiveness of organizational communication is influenced by several characteristics unique to organizations. There are four primary factors. There's the formal channels, which influence communication effectiveness. For example, those formal channels actually get larger and larger as the organization grows or as the organization gets more complex, which puts more strain on the communication within the organization. The authority structure, or who reports to who, affects communication because of status and power differences among different organizational members. Maybe one feels they don't feel comfortable speaking up to their authority, or vice versa. The term information ownership means that individuals possess unique information and knowledge about their jobs. Such information is a form of power for those who possess it. This makes them unwilling in some cases to share that information with others. Job specialization can be both a help and a hindrance in communication. It can facilitate communication within a work group because members speak that same jargon and frequently develop that group cohesiveness, right? The IT department speaks the IT jargon, but that can actually be complicated because then if we refer to the information ownership, that group, this job specialization group, might not want to communicate some of the specific information out. The communication network is the structure through which communication flows through a business or other organizational entity. The formal communication network is the system of official channels that carry organizationally approved messages. Generally, they're much more formal and a lot of times meant for documentation or records. The informal communication network is a less formal way that employees share information in an organization. Finally, there is typically some kind of unofficial network, often referred to as the grapevine. That's the informal transmission of information among workers and sometimes referred to as maybe the water cooler conversation. Let's take a look at an example. if we were to think about changing a procedure within a food service organization, what we have pictured here is a cut glove. So let's say a food service organization determines that they want all of their food service handlers, the people that are handling food, to wear food cut gloves for when they're cutting or slicing or using the slicing machinery. So the formal network of communication around this change would be a series, or perhaps just one, standard operating procedure. It would define the scope, how often the cut glove needs to be used, where it's stored, how it gets handled, and generally the justification of the implementation of that procedure. Typically, there's a date involved, some kind of official communication gets sent by email, and it can get printed and documented, right? So it goes into somebody's file. The informal communication network would be the manager printing out that official procedure and telling his or her stakeholders. So the employees, for example, maybe they get together and have a little meeting to talk about cut gloves. Here is the procedure. Let's go through it. They don't have to necessarily read it or sign it. If they want to, they can, but it's a little bit more informal. Generally, verbal falls into the informal category. Now, what would be the grapevine? Probably that's going to happen in or around the, let's say, the employees' lockers, in the locker room or the bathroom or out on the dock where they're all taking a break. They're talking about the cut gloves, maybe complaining about it or talking about how they're glad that the organization has implemented such a procedure. So you can see the three different kinds and how it relates to just one topic. Within these types, communication actually goes in different directions as well. So there's the downward direction, where individuals at higher levels of the organization communicate downward to those at lower levels. So if we're talking about the cut glove, right, it's the director or the general manager sending out the procedure about the cut glove. The most common form of this type of communication are job instructions, policy or procedure, statements or manuals, official publications of the organization. An effective organization also needs open channels of upward communication as much as it needs downward communication. Remember, this is influenced a lot by authority structure. In large organizations, good upward communication is especially difficult for that reason. People feel timid to talk up or speak up. So suggestion boxes, special meetings, grievance procedures are often used as a way to create that open flow of upward communication. A focus on lateral flow or horizontal flow of communication will enhance organizational effectiveness. Within a food service operation, effective lateral communication between the production and service is critical to ensure the quality food is available at the right time in the right place, maybe to avoid food safety issues, and to be sure everyone is following correct procedures. Let's look at the cut glove again. So a lateral communication would be one chef telling the other chef where the cut glove is being stored, or remind them that they need to be using that cut glove. Finally, there's diagonal communication. The use of diagonal channels is a way of minimizing time and effort expended in organizations. Oftentimes this is between departments that have some kind of diagonal placement in the organization. They're not directly involved in the day-to-day, but they somehow influence. A lot of people think about, like, IT departments or HR departments will often get some outside communication, but not necessarily involved in the day-to-day communication. There's always a chance that some of the miscommunication happens within these four directions. In large organizations, the dilution of information as it passes up and down and even laterally, can lose the focus on the common goal in the organization. So managers should always keep this in mind when they make organizational decisions around communication. Now let's take a look. This is a visual of an organizational job chart. It's got different job roles. So let's name the type of directions for the different colors. Take a look. What color do you think, which channel do you think red represents? Which flow does red represent? If you said horizontal or lateral, you were right. What about purple? Yep, that's the downward communication. And finally, what about gold? If you said upward, you got it. The communication channel is the means by which a message is conveyed. There's nonverbal communication, or communication that is not really spoken or written, but has a lot of meaning to others. A lot of people think about body language when they think about the nonverbals. Body language is the body movement or gesture or even expression that conveys some kind of information to others. Think about a meeting or a class that you were in and you saw some nonverbal cues. There's also verbal intonation, which gives emphasis on different words or phrases. So depending on how you talk about a cut glove might demonstrate that you're either thinking about it positively or negatively, or somebody might pick up on those nuances in the intonation. Finally, there's one-way and two-way communication. One-way obviously flows just in one direction, where two-way gets a little bit of feedback. So it flows in one direction, and then there's feedback given and received. Written and oral communication would fall into these categories. There are many different types of business communication that serve many different purposes. And again, there's always a chance that some of this miscommunication happens within these channels. Someone might pick up on some body language that was not intended, or there might be some misperceived verbal intonation. Again, managers should keep this in mind when they make organizational decisions around communication. In business communication, there are specific times and places that are necessary for the different types of communication channels. In written communication, it is often a bit more formal. So, as you can see by this chart, written is used to convey very specific facts when there's little time urgency. So you've got some more time. You might not need immediate feedback, but somebody could read it and sort of digest it over a week or two. Ideas tend not to be complicated, but are high level. In written communication is used when documentation is required. So you have to document something and keep it in somebody's records, and the message will become part of a permanent file. HR documentation, standard operating procedures, these tend to fall within written communication. Verbal communication tends to be a little bit, again, more informal. So it's used to convey emotions and feelings, or when it's more of an immediate or urgent message. So some time urgency exists, immediate feedback might be needed, or it's just a quick idea, right? So can you make some more coffee is a very quick issue that can be addressed verbally. In this case, documentation tends not to be required, although sometimes verbal communication occurs in the workplace and then managers feel they need to create some written documentation to back it up. Verbal communication obviously does not need to be permanent. As expected, there are many ways an organization can feel the impacts of miscommunication. We've talked about a few. Barriers to communication are very real and can be very challenging in the workplace. Managers feel them all the time. Let's explore a few. Hearing an unexpected message. Past experience may lead one to expect to hear certain messages that may not be correct in some situations. Somebody might ignore conflicting information. For example, a message that disagrees with one's preconceptions is likely to be ignored or just kind of avoided. There's differing perceptions too. Words, actions, and situations are perceived in accordance with the receiver's values and experiences. So it's very important to keep the biases out. Different people tend to react differently to the same message. It's also important to evaluate the source. Where did the message come from? Is it influencing? What about interpreting words differently? Because of the complexity of language, words can have many different meanings. And remember, the intonation of the different phrases or words can also impact. Ignoring nonverbal cues can be really important. Tone of voice, facial expressions, and gesture all affect communication. Becoming emotional is another part. Emotion will affect transmission and interpretation of messages. Have you ever said something you didn't mean to or couldn't quite get the point across because you were more emotional about it? Cultural differences definitely play a part here too. Differences in ethnic, religious, and/or social status may impact the understanding of the message. And linguistics. Different languages, dialects, and accents spoken by the sender and receiver, or use of the overall vocabulary, can really impact the message as well. This chart demonstrates some techniques for improved communication. You can use feedback to become more effective in communication because it allows the sender to search for verbal and nonverbal cues. Using several different channels. For example, you might start with the face-to-face communication or picking up the phone and then follow up with an email. Or conversely, you might send an email and then say, I'm going to follow up with a phone call so that the person can review it prior to the conversation. Being very sensitive to the receiver will enable the communicator to adapt the message to the situation. Being aware of different meanings can be particularly important in communication. Also being aware of how you deliver the message and really sticking to direct, simple language to avoid jargon, to improve overall language as well. Listening is basic to effective communication and is a really essential tool in a manager's toolkit for effective management. In speaking about effective management, here is a graph that demonstrates, or it's pulled from a survey conducted in 2017 by the Project Management Institute. And it demonstrates the effectiveness of communication and how it impacts various aspects of the workplace. For example, staying within budget, effective communication helps. Or wanting to keep on time, effective communication can help here too. What about staying within goals? Effective communicators notice an almost 30% difference in staying to goals. This is a great way to demonstrate how impactful communication can be within the workplace. It is clear by this survey that managers need to work hard on communication. This concludes the recording on communication.